Then decided I'd open the door just a little bit again, and that was when I looked in, and it was dark, so I was trying to make out if Madeleine, where is she, she must be there. And it sounds daft, but I didn't switch the light on. Any parent knows that you don't want to disturb your children. And then suddenly I knew she wasn't there, so I thought she wandered through to our bedroom. So I went through to our bedroom, and when she wasn't there, that was when the panic first set in. And as I rushed back into the children's bedroom, that was the point. And I guess it was chance that it just happened to be a gust of wind, that suddenly the curtains that were closed over just blew open. And that's when I saw that the shutter had been raised and the window was pushed right across. And that's when I knew. I didn't have any doubt, really. I knew that somebody had taken our daughter. But for some reason I thought, well, maybe someone's been in and she's hidden, she's cowering or something, I don't know. But I just flew out the back of the apartment, and then as soon as I saw Jay and our friends, I just started screaming that Madeleine's gone.
For years, one question has followed the Madeleine McCann case like a shadow. What if the story people remember most is not the one the evidence can fully prove? That single idea changed how the case was discussed, how it was analyzed, and why the debate never fully disappeared. Not because the facts became clear, but because several of the earliest conclusions were followed by uncertainty, conflict, and gaps that could not be neatly closed. The apartment, the timeline, the witness accounts, and the forensic discussion all became part of a record that still invites scrutiny. So what actually happened inside apartment 5A on May 3, 2007, and why did the abduction theory remain only one of several explanations people kept returning to? The image of an opened patio door, a quiet holiday apartment, and a timeline built from checking rotation, dinner tables, and repeated statements is exactly where the debate begins, because every detail seemed simple at first, and then became harder to verify with certainty. The most important part of this case is not only what was said in the first hours, but what was later questioned, what could not be conclusively matched, and what remained supported only by partial findings or contested interpretation. If the early account looked complete, why did so many investigators, commentators, and witnesses keep returning to the same narrow set of facts and finding new problems in them? That is where the case becomes more complicated, because each new answer seemed to open another gap, and each gap created another theory that refused to disappear. This video examines the evidence, the interviews, the witness concerns, and the disputed forensic discussion that kept the Madeleine McCann case unresolved in public debate for years. Before you leave, remember that every like, comment, and share helps keep Madeleine McCann's story alive. If you believe unanswered cases deserve attention, your support matters. One subscription helps us bring more forgotten stories, missing persons cases, and investigations to a wider audience. We also want to hear from you. Where are you watching this video from? Tell us your country and your city in the comments. It means a lot to know how far Madeleine's story has reached around the world. So please like this video, share it with someone who cares about justice, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Together we can make sure Madeleine McCann's story is never forgotten. On 3rd May 2007, a child disappeared from a holiday apartment in Praia da Luz, and the question that followed did not stay confined to one police file for long. It spread across the world and became one of the most argued missing person cases in modern European reporting. For years, the public has been given one central narrative: that Madeleine McCann vanished from her family's holiday apartment while her parents were dining nearby, and that the first police assumption pointed toward abduction. But the reason this case never stopped drawing attention was not only the disappearance itself. It was the fact that the early record left room for disagreement, later debate, and continuing scrutiny. The details that entered the public record were simple on the surface, yet difficult to settle with certainty. And that is what made the case endure far beyond the first night in Praia da Luz. If the initial focus was abduction, why did the case continue to generate alternative theories, contested interpretations, and repeated questions about whether the available evidence ever rose to an evidentiary threshold that could settle the matter decisively? The image that remains attached to the case is not only a missing child report, But a quiet apartment, a family holiday, a restaurant a short distance away, and a timeline that has been examined again and again in documentaries, police summaries, and British media coverage. Those repeated retellings did not answer everything. They preserved the uncertainty and made the central question even harder to ignore. The disappearance occurred on 3rd May 2007, when Madeleine, who was 3 years old, was reported missing from her family's holiday apartment in Praia da Luz, Portugal. Public reporting has consistently placed the family at the Ocean Club complex, with her parents dining with friends at a nearby restaurant while the children slept in the apartment. That detail mattered because it shaped the earliest police approach, and it framed the debate that followed. Investigators first pursued abduction as the leading explanation, but the public discussion soon moved beyond that single theory as people began to ask whether the known facts fully supported it. The reason this opening remains central is that the case did not begin with a confirmed answer. It began with a void. There was a missing child, an apartment that had to be reconstructed through witness statements, and an investigation that became international almost immediately. BBC reporting has placed the key timeline in the evening hours of 3rd May, with Madeleine missing by around 10 p.m., a point that became important because it defined the window in which accounts had to be tested against one another. From that moment, the question was no longer only where Madeleine was, but what the evidence could actually prove and what it could not. That distinction is what kept the debate alive. The public record includes repeated references to competing theories, including abduction, accident, and other explanations that appeared in later media coverage and documentary discussion. The existence of those theories did not resolve the case. It showed that the first narrative never eliminated every alternative. When a case remains under discussion after so many years, the reason is usually not a single dramatic fact, but a chain of uncertain facts that never line up cleanly enough to close the file. The investigation also acquired a second life through media treatment, BBC Timeline reporting, British press interviews, and the Netflix documentary The Disappearance of Madeleine McCann all revisited the same narrow set of events. The holiday apartment, the evening meal, the reported missing time, and the unanswered questions around how the scene should be understood. These retellings kept the same core issue in view, because even when the surrounding commentary changed, the central problem remained unchanged. There was still no universally accepted account that removed doubt. That is why this case has remained so resistant to closure. The first chapter of the public debate, therefore, is not only about an abduction theory. It is about the point at which a theory becomes accepted in public memory before the supporting record has been fully settled. In this case, that gap mattered. The investigation entered the world as a missing child case, but the public conversation quickly became a contest between narrative and verification, between what people believed had happened and what could actually be demonstrated from the available record. And that is where the next question begins, because the most difficult part of the Madeleine McCann case is not the fact that she disappeared, but why so many people still return to the same early details and still see something unresolved in them. The night Madeleine disappeared. What really happened inside apartment 5A? Inside apartment 5A, the question was never only where Madeleine was, but what changed during the short stretch of time when the room was left under intermittent supervision and then found without her. The night began as a familiar holiday evening in Praia da Luz, with the McCann family and friends eating at a nearby tapas restaurant while the children remained in the apartment, and it ended with a missing child report that immediately redirected the entire case. What made this timeline so difficult to resolve was not a single dramatic event, but the narrow sequence of ordinary actions, repeated checks, and small time gaps that later became the subject of intense scrutiny in police files, court documents, and media reconstructions. The central issue was simple to state and difficult to answer. What happened during the minutes when nobody saw Madeleine? The layout of the apartment mattered because it was a holiday flat rather than a sealed scene, and because the family and their friends were not inside the room throughout the evening. Public timelines and police reconstructions placed the restaurant at a short distance from the apartment, close enough for a checking routine to be possible, but far enough that no adult had continuous sight of the children. That detail became one of the most debated features of the case. The adult guests were said to be checking the children at intervals, moving between the dining area and the apartment in a pattern that was meant to reduce risk, yet later raised the obvious investigative question of whether those intervals created an opportunity that was never fully accounted for. In investigative terms, the scene was not defined by one uninterrupted chain of observation, but by breaks in observation. And those breaks became the space in which every later theory had to be tested.
The sequence most often cited in public reporting places Jerry McCann at approximately 9 p.m. making a check on the apartment, with Kate McCann noticing Madeleine was missing around 10 p.m. That hour-long span became critical because it framed a time window in which investigators had to determine whether an abduction, an accident, or some other event was plausible. A short timeline can appear precise when written down, but in practice it rests on human recollection, and human recollection can be incomplete, especially when people are under stress and moving between two locations. That is why the checking routine, which initially seemed like a straightforward explanation for how the evening had been managed, later became one of the case's most examined details. The apartment itself was discussed not because it supplied a final answer, but because it defined the limits of what the evidence could show. Public reconstructions repeatedly returned to the same practical facts. The children were asleep, the adults were at the restaurant, and the apartment was reached through short checks rather than constant supervision. Those facts are important because they are compatible with more than one explanation. If a child is later missing from a room that was checked intermittently, investigators must decide whether the absence began before the final check, after it, or during the unobserved interval. That is why the missing time is not a minor detail in this case. It is a central evidentiary gap. Without a fully verified sequence for those minutes, the investigation was left to infer events from partial accounts rather than from direct observation. Court documents and later timeline reconstructions, as reflected in public reporting, kept returning to the same uncertainty. No witness saw the exact moment of disappearance, and no continuous video or forensic record established a complete answer. The absence of that direct evidence mattered because the case began to revolve around what could be reconstructed rather than what could be proven in a strict sense. Even the use of the nearby Tapas restaurant as a reference point carried significance, since the distance allowed the adults to believe they could monitor the children while still eating, but it also created a blind interval that later became the focus of criticism and debate. This is the reason the night of May 3rd, 2007 remains so heavily discussed. The known details are few, and the unknowns are large. Investigators therefore had to answer one important question. What happened the minutes when nobody saw Madeleine? That question did not only shape the first police response, it shaped every later review, because once the timeline was reduced to a few checks, a short dinner walk, and a missing child report, the entire case depended on whether those fragments could support the abduction theory on their own. For that reason, the night inside Apartment 5A remains one of the most disputed parts of the record, not because it contains certainty, but because it contains a gap that every theory must cross and none has completely closed. Why people question the abduction theory? The abduction theory remained central for many years, but it was never free from doubt because several of the most discussed details in the case did not fit neatly into a single explanation. The public debate grew not from one isolated contradiction, but from the accumulation of smaller uncertainties, whether there was any clear sign of forced entry, what the open window actually meant, and how the timeline should be read when the last confirmed observations depended on witness recollection rather than continuous observation. In a case of this kind, the first version of events often becomes the most familiar, but familiarity is not the same as proof, and that distinction shaped much of the criticism around the Madeleine McCann investigation. One of the earliest points of debate was the absence of obvious forced entry. Public reporting and later reviews repeatedly noted that the apartment did not present the kind of clear break-in signs that would normally settle the question quickly, and that led some investigators and commentators to ask how an intruder would have entered and left without leaving a more obvious physical trace. That question did not eliminate the abduction theory, because forced entry is not the only possible method in a child disappearance, and experts pointed out that an abduction could still occur without a visibly damaged door or window. The difficulty was not that the theory was impossible in the abstract. It was that the evidence available to the public did not appear to resolve the method with confidence. In that sense, The debate was not about certainty, but about whether the available record met the level needed to support a firm conclusion. The door and window issue became one of the most repeated parts of the case, largely because it appeared to offer a simple answer, and then became more complicated the longer it was examined. Public discussion focused on an open window and the belief that it might indicate outside access. Yet investigators later debated what that detail actually meant. Initial reporting around the apartment scene made the window one of the most visible features of the immediate response, but later reviews showed that a visible opening did not automatically establish how it came to be that way, when it was opened, or by whom. The important point is not to overstate the window itself, because the case record did not allow a clean conclusion from that one detail alone. It remained an interpretive issue, not a final answer. That uncertainty mattered because the public often expects a physical scene to answer a missing child case with simple clarity, yet the Madeleine McCann record did not behave that way. Investigators had to work with a holiday apartment, a shared checking routine, and accounts from adults who were not continuously present inside the room. That meant even a detail like a window could not be separated from the larger timeline. If the opening was linked to the disappearance, then its meaning depended on when it changed, who noticed it first, and whether it reflected a genuine entry point or a later observation made in a rapidly developing situation. The case never produced a universally accepted answer to those questions, which is why the window remained part of the debate rather than its resolution. The timeline questions were equally important. The last confirmed sighting, the witness accounts, and the missing period between checks became a framework through which the abduction theory was repeatedly tested. In practical terms, investigators had to decide how much weight to give to the final observations of the evening, and whether the gap between checks could support the idea that an outsider entered the apartment and removed Madeleine without being seen. That question became especially difficult because the evidence came largely from statements rather than uninterrupted observation. Witnesses can describe what they believe they saw, but those descriptions still have to be measured against time, distance, and the limits of memory. This is why the timeline never functioned as a simple sequence of facts. It became a contested structure. If the 9 p.m. check is accepted and the around 10:00 p.m. discovery is accepted, then the missing interval must account for what happened in between. But if the witness accounts are treated as approximate rather than exact, then the gap itself becomes less certain, and the theory must carry more interpretive weight than direct proof. That is where the public debate deepened, because a theory that depends heavily on a narrow and uncertain time span invites scrutiny from every angle. The more the case was examined, the more it appeared that the abduction theory had to answer not only what happened, but how investigators could be sure enough to rule out other possibilities. Portuguese police files, UK police reviews, and later court records did not eliminate those concerns. They preserved them in a more formal setting. The result was a case in which the abduction theory remained possible, but not uncontested. That distinction is important, because public debate often treats possibility as proof, while legal and investigative standards require more than that. The evidence could support concern, inference, and suspicion, but the contested details kept the record from becoming self-explanatory. The reason people continued to question the theory was therefore not one single anomaly, but the combined effect of missing certainty in the physical scene, unresolved meaning in the window and door discussion, and a timeline that depended on human recollection during a short and critical window. In a case that has been revisited for years, those same questions still return, because the evidence never answered them all at once. And until those details are read in a way that satisfies both investigators and the public record, the abduction theory will remain one explanation among several, not a fully closed conclusion. The interviews that people still analyze. The interviews in this case became controversial not because every statement was identical, but because public interpretation often moved faster than investigative conclusion. In the Madeleine McCann record, that gap mattered more than in many other cases, because television interviews, press conferences, and documentary footage turned short answers, pauses, and repeated explanations into material for wider debate. The result was a situation in which the original words remain on the record, but the meaning attached to them changed depending on who was listening, when they were listening, and what theory they already believed. Kate McCann's interviews drew sustained attention because her statement about that night were repeatedly replayed in the media and read against the developing timeline of the disappearance. Public reaction was often shaped less by the full interview context than by isolated moments, including emotion under pressure, hesitation, and the way journalists framed the significance of specific answers. In legal terms, that kind of interpretation is unstable, because an interview can contain a clear factual account while still being presented in public, as though every visible reaction carries independent proof. BBC reporting on the Leveson inquiry recorded McCann saying they were left distraught by press suggestions that they were responsible for their daughter's death, and Kate McCann described feeling totally violated after private material was published. Those remarks show the wider environment in which the interviews were consumed, not as narrow statements for investigators alone, but as public events that were repeatedly repackaged and reinterpreted. Jerry McCann's interviews also became part of the long-running scrutiny because he repeatedly addressed the timeline, the checking routine, and the accusations that followed the family after Madeleine disappeared. His explanation of the evening was important because it sought to describe a practical sequence of events rather than a dramatic narrative, yet media coverage often extracted one line or one reaction and placed it into a broader story about suspicion. In the Leveson inquiry evidence, Jerry McCann said many stories were untruthful, sinister, or, in his belief, made up, which reflects how central the media environment had become to the public reading of the case. That is why his public statements continue to be analyzed. They sit at the juncture between the family's own account and the way that account was challenged in the press. The distinction between what he said and what people believed he meant became one of the most persistent features of the case. The police interviews added another layer of controversy because they moved the case from public discussion into formal investigative procedure. BBC reporting noted that Portuguese police questioned witnesses with Metropolitan Police detectives observing, and that British officers supplied a large set of questions while Portuguese officers conducted the interviews. That structure mattered because it showed that the two systems were working together, but not in the same way. The Portuguese authorities controlled the questioning, while the British team monitored proceedings and sought consistency across witness accounts. Public understanding of those interviews was often simplified into a search for new leads, yet official reporting made clear that the interviews were also about checking inconsistencies, testing old statements, and determining whether anything previously missed could now be clarified. In other words, an interview could be significant in an investigative sense without producing a dramatic public breakthrough. Portuguese investigators' statements and British investigators' comments were therefore not always read in the same way as their actual procedural purpose. The BBC reported that questioning of several suspects and witnesses concluded without new developments, while a source close to the inquiry said the interviews had led to no new developments, and we are back where we were 7 years ago. That is an important distinction because it shows the difference between investigative disappointment and public narrative. To the public, a no new development interview can sound like failure. To investigators, it can still serve a narrower purpose of narrowing possibilities or confirming that a line of inquiry does not advance. The same applies to the use of arguido status, which carried specific legal meaning in Portuguese law and did not automatically prove guilt. This legal nuance was frequently lost in wider discussion. The reason these interviews still matter is that they created a permanent record that people continue to rewatch, quote, and argue over. Documentary footage, television clips, and press conference moments gave the case a visual memory that often outlived the investigative context in which the statements were made. That is why the public often treats the interviews as evidence of hidden meaning, while the official record treats them more cautiously as statements to be weighed alongside other material. Public interpretation and investigative conclusions are not always the same thing, and this case shows a divide with unusual clarity. This is also why the interview section remains the strongest and most argued part of the broader debate. Each statement became a reference point. Each reaction became a talking point, and each police interview became a reminder that a case can live in public memory very differently from how it lives inside an inquiry file. The result is not a neat answer, but a continuing split between what the interviews appear to say and what the investigation could actually confirm. The forensic evidence debate. The forensic debate in the Madeleine McCann case endured because the evidence did not produce one clean conclusion, and the public record repeatedly showed how different investigators could read the same material in different ways. Cadaver dog alerts, DNA samples, and forensic reviews became the center of controversy not because they sell the case, but because they appear to suggest significance while still falling short of fully conclusive identification. That gap between suggestion and proof is what kept the debate alive, because the forensic material was always discussed alongside its limits, not apart from them. The cadaver dog evidence became one of the most debated subjects because specialist dogs reportedly alerted to possible human remains sent in apartment 5A and in the McCann's rental car, and those alerts were quickly treated by some commentators as highly significant. The controversy arose because dog alerts are not, by themselves, proof of what happened. In forensic practice, canine indication can point investigators toward an area or object, but it still requires corroboration from independent evidence, and that limitation was central in this case. Public reporting showed that the McCann side later emphasized the unreliability of cadaver dog evidence, while critics argued that the alert should not have been dismissed too quickly. The important point is that the dog created suspicion, but suspicion is not the same as proof. The reason the dog evidence became so controversial was that it seemed, to some observers, to connect multiple locations that were otherwise difficult to explain. Reports described alerts in the apartment and the rental vehicle, and those alerts were then folded into broader theories about what may have happened after Madeleine disappeared. But the forensic debate immediately moved to the question of reliability, because experienced handlers and legal observers noted that cadaver dogs can generate false positives and that their signals must be supported by other evidence before they can carry decisive weight. The public often wanted the dog results to mean more than they legally could. That mismatch between expectation and evidentiary standard was a major reason the issue did not resolve the case. DNA evidence created a separate controversy for the same reason. Samples were collected from the apartment and from vehicles, and those samples became the subject of intense debate over what they actually showed. The central problem was not the existence of DNA testing, but the limitations of the samples themselves. Reports referred concerns about small sample size, contamination risk, and the difficulty of drawing strong conclusions from degraded or partial material. In forensic terms, a partial marker does not equal a unique match, and that distinction mattered here because the results that entered public discussion were interpreted far beyond what the science could firmly establish. The samples could guide an investigation, but they could not by themselves close it. This is why the DNA discussion became so difficult to contain. Some reports initially suggested stronger significance, but that was quickly tempered by later commentary from officials and experts who stressed that DNA does not contain guilt or innocence, only identification value under the right conditions. The debate then shifted to whether the evidence had been overread. British forensic experts raised doubts about the size and condition of some specimens, while Portuguese officials also avoided presenting the DNA as mathematically decisive. That caution mattered because it showed how easily forensic language can be simplified in public conversation. A report that seems strong at first can become much less definitive once chain of custody, sample quality, and transfer possibility are considered. Forensic reviews added still more complexity because different experts reached different interpretations of the same items. Some viewed the dog alerts and DNA traces as part of a larger pattern that deserved close attention, while others stressed that the evidentiary threshold had not been met for a final conclusion. Court documents and official statements repeatedly reflected that tension, because the case file had to hold both the possibility of significance and the inability to verify it with certainty. That is a familiar feature of major investigations, but in this case it became unusually public. Every new report was treated like a turning point, even when the actual forensic meaning remained limited. The broader controversy also came from the fact that forensic findings were being read against a deeply emotional and highly public case. The apartment, the car, the toys, and the clothing became symbolic objects in a narrative that many people believe should have yielded a final answer long ago. But forensic science does not operate through symbolism. It operates through testing, comparison, contamination analysis, and a careful distinction between probable, possible, and proven. That is why the same evidence could support suspicion without supporting certainty. The debate therefore remained unresolved not because the forensic material was ignored, but because it could be interpreted in more than one way and never established a unique match that ended the argument. Cadaver dogs pointed to possible significance, DNA raised questions, and forensic reviews showed how quickly interpretation could outpace proof. That is the reason this section of the case remains central to public memory. It created the appearance of answers, but it did not produce the kind of verified conclusion that would have settled the matter. The witnesses who created more questions. Witness accounts became one of the most difficult parts of the Madeleine McCann case because they offered possible connections to the timeline, but they also introduced uncertainty, memory limits, and disagreement over what was actually seen. In a case that already depended on short time gaps and incomplete observation, each sighting had to be weighed carefully. The result was that several witness statements did not settle the investigation. They deepened it, because investigators had to decide whether a sighting was truly relevant, whether it matched the known timeline, and whether memory could be trusted after the event. That is why the witness section remains so heavily discussed. It contains details that appear important, yet resist final confirmation. The Jane Tanner sighting became one of the most discussed elements in the case because it appeared, at least initially, to give the investigation a specific visual lead. According to public reporting, Tanner said she saw a man carrying a child away from the resort around 45 minutes before Madeleine was reported missing, and that observation quickly became tied to the abduction theory. The reason it mattered was not only that it described a man and a child, but that it seemed to place suspicious movement in the same general time frame as the disappearance, creating the possibility that the sighting and the missing child report were linked. That made the statement important in early debate, because it looked like a clue that might help investigators narrow the relevant window. But the same sighting also raised questions. Police files show that Tanner's account was later examined with close attention, including details about what she saw, when she saw it, and how certain she could be about the observation. The problem was not simply whether she believed what she reported, but whether the sighting could be reliably connected to Madeleine or to the actual disappearance. Public discussion often moved faster than investigative review, and the sighting acquired a near-symbolic status long before its limitations were fully understood. In legal terms, a witness statement can be meaningful without being conclusive, and that is exactly how this one functioned. It was important, but it was not a final answer. The Smith family's sighting created a different kind of difficulty. Martin Smith later contacted police and said that, after seeing the McCann family on television, he believed the man he saw carrying the child that night may have been Jerry McCann, while also stating that he could not say that as a fact. That detail made the sighting significant because it came from a separate set of witnesses outside the main dining group, and seemed to support the possibility that a child had been carried away near the area around the relevant time. Yet the statement was cautious, and that caution mattered. The witness did not claim certainty, only possibility, and that distinction is crucial in forensic investigation. A possible match can raise questions, but it does not prove identity. The Smith sighting also showed how investigators must handle memory after fact. The family statement developed only after later reflection, and after seeing television images, which means the identification process was influenced by recognition and comparison rather than by a fully immediate identification at the scene. That does not make the account useless, but it does place it in a category that requires caution. Witnesses can honestly believe what they remember, while still being affected by time, stress, and later exposure to images or narratives. This is one of the central reasons investigators treat witness statements as leads rather than conclusions. Other witness statements added more layers to the same problem. Some accounts matched the broad timeline, while others differed on small but important points, such as exact time, direction of movement, or the appearance of the person seen. That kind of variation is common in cases involving nighttime observation, distance, and limited visibility, but it becomes especially important when the investigation depends on a narrow time window. In this case, the differences were not enough to settle the abduction theory, but they were enough to keep it under constant review. The more witnesses were analyzed, the more the case appeared to rest on fragments rather than certainty. Memory reliability became a serious issue because the witnesses were being asked to recall ordinary details from an extraordinary night, often long after the event. Under those conditions, confidence and accuracy are not the same thing. A witness may be sincere and still be mistaken, especially when later media coverage, public discussion, and repeated retelling change how the memory is organized. That is why investigators had to compare statements across sources rather than rely on one account alone. In many cases, the challenge was not whether someone saw something, but whether what was seen could be verified against a wider record. The witnesses who created more questions. Witness accounts became one of the most difficult parts of the Madeleine McCann case because they offered possible connections to the timeline, but they also introduced uncertainty, memory limits, and disagreement over what was actually seen. In a case that already depended on short time gaps and incomplete observation, each sighting had to be weighed carefully. The result was that several witness statements did not settle the investigation. They deepened it, because investigators had to decide whether a sighting was truly relevant, whether it matched the known timeline, and whether memory could be trusted after the event. That is why the witness section remains so heavily discussed. It contains details that appear important, yet resist final confirmation. The Jane Tanner sighting became one of the most discussed elements in the case because it appeared, at least initially, to give the investigation a specific visual lead. According to public reporting, Tanner said she saw a man carrying a child away from the resort around 45 minutes before Madeleine was reported missing, and that observation quickly became tied to the abduction theory. The reason it mattered was not only that it described a man and a child, but that it seemed to place suspicious movement in the same general time frame as the disappearance, creating the possibility that the sighting and the missing child report were linked. That made the statement important in early debate, because it looked like a clue that might help investigators narrow the relevant window. But the same sighting also raised questions. Police files show that Tanner's account was later examined with close attention, including details about what she saw, when she saw it, and how certain she could be about the observation. The problem was not simply whether she believed what she reported, but whether the sighting could be reliably connected to Madeleine or to the actual disappearance. Public discussion often moved faster than investigative review, and the sighting acquired a near-symbolic status long before its limitations were fully understood. In legal terms, a witness statement can be meaningful without being conclusive, and that is exactly how this one functioned. It was important, but it was not a final answer. The Smith family's sighting created a different kind of difficulty. Martin Smith later contacted police and said that, after seeing the McCann family on television, he believed the man he saw carrying the child that night may have been Jerry McCann, while also stating that he could not say that as a fact. That detail made the sighting significant because it came from a separate set of witnesses outside the main dining group, and seemed to support the possibility that a child had been carried away near the area around the relevant time. Yet the statement was cautious, and that caution mattered. The witness did not claim certainty, only possibility, and that distinction is crucial in forensic investigation. A possible match can raise questions, but it does not prove identity. The Smith sighting also showed how investigators must handle memory after the fact. The family statement developed only after later reflection and after seeing television images, which means the identification process was influenced by recognition and comparison rather than by a fully immediate identification at the scene. That does not make the account useless, but it does place it in a category that requires caution. Witnesses can honestly believe what they remember, while still being affected by time, stress, and later exposure to images or narratives. This is one of the central reasons investigators treat witness statements as leads rather than conclusions. Other witness statements added more layers to the same problem. Some accounts matched the broad timeline, while others differed on small but important points, such as exact time, direction of movement, or the appearance of the person seen. That kind of variation is common in cases involving nighttime observation, distance, and limited visibility, but it becomes especially important when the investigation depends on a narrow time window. In this case, the differences were not enough to settle the abduction theory, but they were enough to keep it under constant review. The more witnesses were analyzed, the more the case appeared to rest on fragments rather than certainty. Memory reliability became a serious issue because the witnesses were being asked to recall ordinary details from an extraordinary night, often long after the event. Under those conditions, confidence and accuracy are not the same thing. A witness may be sincere and still be mistaken, especially when later media coverage, public discussion, and repeated retelling change how the memory is organized. That is why investigators had to compare statements across sources rather than rely on one account alone. In many cases, the challenge was not whether someone saw something, but whether what was seen could be verified against a wider record. This is also why the witness section remains so important to the wider Madeleine McCann debate. Jane Tanner's report, the Smith family sighting, and the other statements did not create a single clear answer, They created a field of competing interpretations. Some accounts seem to support the idea that something suspicious happened near the apartment, while others showed how quickly a sighting can become contested once time, memory, and later discussion are introduced. The investigation had to work inside that uncertainty, and the public debate has never fully separated the value of a witness statement from the limits of what it can actually prove. The theory that changed the investigation. The Madeleine McCann case did not remain fixed inside one investigative frame. It moved through distinct phases as new information emerged, and that movement changed which theories received attention, which lines of inquiry were expanded, and which possibilities were treated as more urgent at different points in time. In the earliest stage, the inquiry was shaped by the disappearance itself and by the immediate assumption that a child had been taken from the apartment. But later reviews and international cooperation pushed the case into a broader search structure, where investigators had to test whether the original theory still explained the available evidence. The important point is not that one theory was simply discarded, but that the investigation evolved as new information emerged, and that evolution altered the direction of the case. The Portuguese phase of the inquiry established the first formal structure around the disappearance. As the BBC and other public timelines have reported, the case began in Praia de Luz in 2007 and quickly expanded from a local missing person report into a major international investigation. Over time, Portuguese authorities reviewed the evidence, questioned witnesses, and handled the early legal classification of people of interest, including the period in which Kate and Jerry McCann were designated as arguido under Portuguese procedure. That designation did not settle guilt, but it did show that the investigation had already moved beyond a simple missing child response and into a more complicated legal phase. When the Portuguese investigation later closed and then returned in revised form after new indications, it became clear that the case had entered a cycle of reassessment rather than closure. The Scotland Yard phase changed the public and investigative tone again. BBC reporting from 2013 recorded that the Metropolitan Police had had new evidence and new witnesses, and had moved from review to formal investigation, a significant shift because it meant British police believed there were still lines of inquiry worth pursuing. Det.ch in Redwood said there was no clear, definitive proof that Madeleine McCann is dead, which is an important legal and investigative statement because it showed that the British Review did not accept the case as closed on the basis of assumptions alone. This stage did not prove one explanation over another. Instead, it reopened the possibility that older material could be read in a different way, and that previously overlooked leads might still matter. That is how the case shifted. Not by final proof, but by repeated reassessment. The British Review also mattered because it brought structure to old uncertainty. Scotland Yard had sifted through the case files, identified new avenues of investigation, and signaled that not all promising leads would necessarily produce results. That language is careful, and it reflects the reality of major investigations. A theory can be tested without being confirmed, and a new line of inquiry can be useful even if it does not lead to a charge. The public often reads such developments as dramatic reversals, but investigators typically treat them as incremental changes in the weight given to different possibilities. In this case, the shift to a formal British inquiry did not erase the earlier theory of abduction. It expanded the investigation into a broader evidentiary search. The later German investigation updates added a further turn. Public timelines reported that German authorities identified a convicted rapist as a suspect, later naming Christian Bruckner in the case, and eventually stating that Madeleine was presumed dead while continuing to treat him as a suspect in the disappearance. This did not mean the case had been solved in a full legal sense. It meant a different authority was now focusing on a different possibility, informed by its own evidence base and procedural approach. The significance of that shift is that it moved the public conversation away from the earlier family-centered controversy and toward an external suspect theory. But even then, the investigation remained dependent on proof, corroboration, and the ability to connect the suspect to the relevant time and place. What changed the investigation most was not any one declaration, but the cumulative effect of these phases. Portuguese police, Scotland Yard reviews, and German updates all pointed to the same underlying reality. The case could not be resolved by one theory alone, because each phase exposed different gaps, different assumptions, and different limits in the evidence. The original abduction narrative remained part of the record, but later authorities were also prepared to consider alternative possibilities and new suspects as the evidence base shifted. That is why the investigation evolved rather than ended. New information did not simply confirm an old view. It changed what investigators were willing to test. This phase-by-phase movement is crucial because it explains why the case remained active for so long. Each review carried the possibility that prior assumptions were incomplete, and each new lead created a fresh need to compare theory with evidence. The official record therefore became layered. One stage built on another, but none produced a final answer strong enough to end the wider debate. The theory that changed the investigation was not a single dramatic claim, but a recognition that the case would have to be reread every time new information emerged. And that is why the story continued to move, even when the outcome remained unresolved. Why this debate still exists today. A case where questions remain bigger than answers. The debate that surrounds the disappearance of Madeleine McCann persists not because of record. Why this debate still exists today. A case where questions remain bigger than answers. The debate that surrounds the disappearance of Madeleine McCann persists not because the record is silent, but because the record is fragmented, partial, and open to competing interpretations. After May 3rd, 2007, the investigation produced a large volume of witness statements, forensic reports, media narratives, and speculative theories, yet it did not produce a single piece of physical evidence that met the evidentiary threshold required for a definitive reconstruction of events. That absence has allowed multiple narratives to coexist, each supported by selective reading of the same material, and each reinforced by the passage of time, which has turned early uncertainties into entrenched positions. The result is a case in which the questions have grown larger than the answers, and where every new detail. A case where questions remain bigger than answers. The debate that surrounds the disappearance of Madeleine McCann persists not because the record is silent, but because the record is fragmented, partial, and open to competing interpretations. After May 3rd, 2007, the investigation produced a large volume of witness statements, forensic reports, media narratives, and speculative theories, yet it did not produce a single piece of physical evidence that met the evidentiary threshold required for a definitive reconstruction of events. That absence has allowed multiple narratives to coexist, each supported by selective reading of the same material, and each reinforced by the passage of time, which has turned early uncertainties into entrenched positions. The result is a case in which the questions have grown larger than the answers, and where every new detail is absorbed into pre-existing frameworks rather than resolving them. A central reason the debate continues is the missing evidence. No body was recovered. No clothing belonging to Madeleine was found in a location that could be tied to a specific sequence of events, and no murder weapon or instrument of restraint was identified. Forensic testing of apartment 5A and of the rental car used by the McCann family 25 days after the disappearance yielded biological material that could not be conclusively determined to originate from Madeleine in a manner that established unique identity. British and Portuguese forensic services stated that samples were degraded, small, and at risk of contamination, and that a unique match was not established. Cadaver dog alerts and blood dog alerts in the apartment and in the vehicle were recorded, but such alerts require corroboration and, in this instance, were not accompanied by recoverable tissue or sufficient DNA to confirm presence of remains. Without physical remains, the case has remained in a state of evidential suspension, where absence of body prevents closure and where every trace is treated as potentially significant yet ultimately inconclusive. Conflicting interpretations of the available facts have also sustained the debate. The same set of timelines, witness recollections, and behavioral observations has been read in at least two opposing directions. One reading holds that the sequence of events on the evening of May 3rd, 2007, particularly the checking rotation among the group dining at the Tapas restaurant, the state of the patio doors, and the timing of the discovery at approximately 10 o'clock, is consistent with an opportunity for an external intruder to enter apartment 5A and remove the child. Another reading holds that discrepancies in accounts, the absence of signs of forced entry consistent with burglary, and the forensic dog alerts in the apartment and the later hired car are more consistent with an accidental death followed by concealment, a theory advanced by Portuguese investigators at certain points in 2007 and reported in contemporary media. Both readings rely on the same underlying data but emphasize different elements and assign different weights to uncertainty. Because the forensic service stated that a unique match was not established, and because witness statements contained inconsistencies, neither interpretation has been able to displace the other with certainty. Media attention has amplified the divergence of interpretations, and has contributed to the persistence of the debate. The case received intense international coverage from the first days, with extensive reporting on the parents, the group of friends, the Portuguese police, and the British inquiry that later became Operation Grange. Media narratives alternated between portrayals of the McCann family as grieving parents pursuing their daughter and portrayals that highlighted alleged inconsistencies and raised questions about parental responsibility. Unofficial sources, including unnamed police contacts and speculative newspaper reports, circulated allegations of sedation, of DNA said initially to be a 100% match and later revised, and of disposal scenarios involving a bag filled with stones and a Marinette Legos, all of which were either denied, treated as unverified, or found to have no basis upon investigation. The coexistence of these narratives in public discourse has ensured that the case is remembered not as a single story, but as a set of competing stories, each supported by selected facts and each resistant to full disconfirmation in the absence of definitive evidence. Multiple theories have been advanced and archived over the years, and each has contributed to the longevity of the debate. Public reporting and official statements have documented hypotheses, including an accident within the apartment, an opportunistic abduction by an unknown person, a burglary that escalated, and parental involvement leading to concealment. Later, a designated suspect, Christian Bruckner, was identified by German prosecutors in 2020. And Operation Grange stated that there was sufficient evidence to charge him with Madeleine's murder, though no indictment has been brought and no trial has occurred. This development introduced a new focal point for interpretation without resolving the underlying evidentiary gaps, because the physical evidence required for conviction has not been presented in open court. The coexistence of earlier theories with the later suspect designation has ensured that the case remains a site of active speculation, with each theory drawing on different subsets of the record and each retaining proponents who regard alternative explanations as insufficient. The mystery of Madeleine McCann continues not because there are no clues, but because every clue has been interpreted differently. The absence of a body, the inconclusive forensic findings, the conflicting witness recollections, and the layered media narratives have combined to produce a situation in which certainty is not attainable with the existing material. Probability suggests that, without physical evidence that can be uniquely matched and without a judicial finding that meets the threshold for conviction, the case is likely to remain unsolved in the public imagination. The debate endures because the record allows it to endure, and because each new statement, each archive report, and each renewed investigation adds another layer to a story that has not reached a final, evidentially closed conclusion.